How about that phone call? The U.S. president going over the heads of the Ukrainian and Europeans, promising talks immediately with Vladimir Putin. This on the same day that his new defense secretary told NATO counterparts that returning to the Ukrainian borders of 2014 was unrealistic. Donald Trump may not have forced a sit down on day one of his presidency, as he had boasted he would do as a candidate, but here it comes. What can Volodymyr Zelensky do or say as he meets in person in Munich with the likes of Pete Hegseth, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the sidelines of the upcoming Munich Security Conference? The likes of France insist they'll continue to honor bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, with or without the United States, but by keeping out Russia's neighbors in Europe. Is this the beginning of the end of the NATO alliance as we know it, the one that's kept the peace on the continent and kept it throughout the Cold War, with Trump wanting the EU to finance Ukraine's reconstruction? What do Europeans ask for in return? What leverage do they have? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about Trump's call. With us, she covered Trump's first term from the White House for us, France 24 International Affairs editor Ketevan Gorgestani. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well from the village of Bonneville-la-Louvet in the northwest Normandy region of France, Germany's former ambassador to NATO, Joachim Bitterlich. Good to see you.
Pleasure as always.
Anastasia Shapachkina, president of the Eastern Circle's think tank, lecturer in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. France's former ambassador to Russia, Jean de Glignassi, your latest book is in French. It's called Geopolitics of Russia in 40 charts. Is that how you would translate it roughly?
Chapters, yeah.
40 chapters. Thanks for being with us. By the way, you can listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. There were those who hoped Donald Trump might, quietly forget his campaign promise to force a settlement on Ukraine. It didn't happen on day one, but here it comes. Yinko Iatade has more.
It's probably the most talking Washington and Moscow have done since the start of the war in Ukraine. After a phone call that lasted almost 90 minutes with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump announced that the two sides agreed to immediately start talks to end the war. Peace that the U.S. leader believes could come soon.
We talked about the possibility, I mentioned it, of a ceasefire so we can stop the killing, and I think we'll probably end up at some point getting a ceasefire in the not-too-distant future.
In a sign that Kyiv may see its fate decided by the U.S. and Russia, Trump called the Ukrainian president only after speaking to Putin. In spite of this, Volodymyr Zelensky praised Trump for what he says is his genuine interest in securing peace.
President Trump informed me of what Putin had told him. We believe that America's strength is enough to, together with us, together with all our partners, enough to push Russia and Putin towards peace.
The Kremlin statement on the call was more measured, with no sign that Moscow is prepared to soften its stance.
President Putin, for his part, mentioned the need to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and agreed with Trump that a long-term settlement could be achieved through peaceful negotiations.
Reacting to the call, the EU says it must be part of any peace deal.
There will be no just and lasting peace in Ukraine without the participation of the Europeans, whether that's with NATO. For peace to be lasting, the Europeans will have to contribute.
Donald Trump says he'll likely hold talks with his Russian counterpart in Saudi Arabia soon.
Ketevan Gorgestani, Donald Trump keeps his campaign promises. Is he? Your thoughts on this call, which happens, a little over 3 weeks into his presidency, but it's happened.
It's happened, and there was a little bit of a debate just a few days ago when he was asked whether he had spoken to Vladimir Putin. He had simply left it pretty vague, saying he had a call, but he didn't define whether he had it before or after taking office. It seems that had happened before he had taken office, and this is the first official call of the sitting U.S. president. the fact that he managed to have it so quickly shows that he, as he has said, and on that I think we can believe him, is that he doesn't really care who wins or loses in this fight. What he wants is to have a deal, because he said he was going to have a deal, and he has presented himself as the peacemaker, the deal maker, and so he went for, I assume, the one that he thinks is in a stronger position, maybe. But the result is that he had that call with Vladimir Putin first, and then spoke to Vladimir Zelensky, and doesn't look like the Europeans knew that this was going to happen.
And the Kremlin spokesperson saying Ukraine would participate one way or another in any talks to end the war, but that there would be a separate U.S.-Russian track to the talks. As for Donald Trump, listen as he really does go over the head of Volodymyr Zelensky.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace. I said that was not a good war to go into, and I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
Would you support Zelensky ceding territory or exchanging territory in any agreement to end the war?
Well, he's going to have to do what he has to do, but, you know, his poll numbers aren't particularly great, to put it mildly. He's got a country where, you know, it's been savaged and attacked.
His poll numbers aren't great. Anastasia Shapachkina, several times during those remarks, Donald Trump calling on Zelensky to hold elections. They've been delayed because of the war. Does he have it in for Zelensky, personally?
Well, if I were Donald Trump, I would be the last person to talk about poll numbers, starting his presidency with the lowest approval ratings of many U.S. presidents.
Gone up since, though.
Well, gone up since. But I would not be very well placed if I were Donald Trump to talk about approval ratings. Now, the presidential elections in Ukraine, obviously do not fall under any international standards if they're conducted now. And this is something that Kremlin has pushed a lot for, because, of course, if they are conducted now, any outcome can be rejected.
So you're saying Donald Trump was using a Kremlin talking point there?
Absolutely, Kremlin talking point. This is not the only one, just one out of 24. But it is a major one, because, of course, it allows Kremlin both to endorse a candidate that Kremlin would make participate in these elections and promote, or reject a candidate if it doesn't like it, because having an election in a country, when 1/5 of it is occupied by a foreign power, it is absolutely renders the election illegitimate. Even more so when between 5 to 10 million people have exoded the country, and even more so when the rest of the population can be bombed while the election is taking place, and therefore a lot of people will be just afraid to participate. So this election is set for the Kremlin to then be able to deny
and saying that
render legitimate.
Refusing to answer on whether or not Ukraine was an equal member of the peace process.
This is another a much more powerful Kremlin point that Trump is playing there, because, of course, for Vladimir Putin, Ukrainian president has never been seen as an equal to himself. To Vladimir Putin, the equal is, for example, U.S. president, maybe Xi Jinping is an equal, but that's it. And he stated it in numerous speeches that Putin gave over years. Trump, with this phone call, has demonstrated that indeed he hasn't departed too much from his position and his view of Russia of 2016, when he claimed that he doesn't have any ground to trust Putin less than to trust the CIA. And now what do we see? He is having a very amicable, what he's calling productive call with Vladimir Putin, while he's about to dismantle the whole of the CIA. So he's living definitely true to himself and to his electoral promise. But when he is exactly like Putin, treating Ukraine not as a Ukrainian president, not as an equal, as a president of a state, but just as a subject to whether Russia, he's saying, or not Russia, doesn't matter. Somebody's subject. Ukraine is going to be part of something. It doesn't even allow for Ukraine as an independent state, even in theory. Then this is very, of course, concerning, and this is definitely a Kremlin point.
Joachim Biederlich, if you support Ukraine and you want to remain an optimist, you can say that Donald Trump is somebody who enjoys performative politics, likes to grab headlines, likes to shock people. If you're more pessimistic, you're saying, as you just heard, Donald Trump is doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. Is that the case?
Well, I'm a bit surprised what I'm hearing tonight here, because for me, Trump's step is not at all a surprise. I was sure he would try to launch talks in this way. My secret wish had been that he should have phoned to Putin together with Xi Jinping. But for me, the whole relation, Russia-Ukraine, has been from the beginning, from 91, what I call an agreement to disagree. We saw this as an independent state. We accepted Ukraine as an independent state, but in Moscow, in my eyes, no one has ever accepted the Ukraine as a really independent state. Therefore, all the arguments about elections put aside, Ukrainian elections in the eyes of Moscow have never been legitimate elections.
And so on what you heard, is it shocking? Is it acceptable?
Well, I saw this way from the beginning. For me, it's the only way to get into talks. Otherwise, Putin will refuse any talks, for example, under European auspices or under auspices of Macron and Scholz till today. What he likes is to talk directly to the US, whom he considers as the only equal partner for him.
Is it rewarding Vladimir Putin, though?
It's a recognition of facts, no more, no less for me.
Jean de Glignesti, when you think back to your time as ambassador in Moscow, this idea that Russia didn't see Ukraine as an independent state?
Well, Russia could accept Ukraine as an independent state, provided that it would be a friendly state. And I remember some high-ranking official telling me, it was in 2012, saying, for us, Ukraine is a problem solved. Why? Because we got the neutrality in a law. We got the Russian language in a law, and we got the lease on the Sebastopol base for our fleet. For us, it's okay. And for them, all the trouble began with Maidan.
As you can imagine, Russian state television in overdrive after the news broke, with some, like the host of Russia 1's big evening news chat show, pinching himself.
You'll notice that there are no negative connotations or judgments in Donald Trump's words. He never talks about Russia's aggression or unjustified attack. He never talks about those horrible war criminals. No, he speaks very calmly, very politely, refers to history, and takes into account the root causes of this conflict.
Seen here from the West, it gets the sense that seeing the delight of Russian chat shows, it does seem startling.
Well, I don't know. I think Trump is a realistic man. He wants to compete with China, not with Russia, and so he took every means to assuage Russia, and that's why he didn't insult Putin. And that's why, most probably, will yield a lot to Russia in the Ukrainian negotiation.
Ketevan Gorgistani?
He has already yielded a lot. He has basically given at least what the first initial demands of Vladimir Putin were. He has given him all of that. You've seen Pete Hegseth talking about how NATO membership, forget about it. U.S. Being involved in security guarantees for Ukraine, forget about it. Returning to 2014 borders, forget about it. And when you look at that, this is negotiation 101. Maybe this is where you'll get in the end, but you don't give those right away. And I just want to quote John Bolton, who's the former national security advisor turned foe of Donald Trump, and who said, by making these concessions, even before the negotiations have started, Trump, has effectively surrendered to Putin on Ukraine. He's basically giving him everything that Vladimir Putin had said in the end, and he's not leaving any bargaining chips to the Ukrainians, to Vladimir Zelensky, if one day they get into an actual Ukraine-Russia negotiation.
There is a nuance for that, because Biden said exactly the same thing. But Biden said, I don't want Ukraine in NATO.
Biden said Ukraine in NATO is inevitable. That was...
Biden never said anything near than what Trump said. Definitely very different.
He said no, concretely.
Okay, but let's listen to a clip that I'm sure that you did not hear from Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary under Biden, the new Defense Secretary, the one that Kedivon's referring. By the way, himself also a former television talk show personality. Pete Hegseth, in his first major foreign foray after his confirmation in the U.S. Senate, telling NATO counterparts in Brussels to give up on maximalist demands.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective.
Unrealistic objective. You heard Kedivon saying that that is a bad negotiating strategy. But is he telling the truth there? You won't be returning to the 2014 borders.
To be precise, the U.S. does not have any negotiating strategy. It is just repeating what Russia has said, has always repeated, and it doesn't have any position whatsoever. It has failed negotiation 101 course absolutely perfectly, starting with saying how pressed for time Trump was, that he at first had only 24 hours to negotiate. I wonder if anybody who's ever negotiated has ever given up how much time they had from the very start and said how little time they had. And then second, laid out, repeated every single demand as a starting point of the adversary and then yielded immediately. Absolute failure. But second is to come back to the point made by former ambassador just previously that about the facts. Of course, we can all yield, being France, Germany, the US, anybody at all, to the Russian point of view and to the Russian view of the world by saying this is a fact. You know what? Ukraine is part of Russia, as Trump said, part of Russia, part of something else. We don't care. But the facts are that Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, has become a legal heir. This is a term that was employed, a legal heir of the Soviet Union at the United Nations. Правопреемник, okay, the Russian word. As a правопреемник or the legal heir of the of the Soviet Union and the United Nations,
taking its veto right at the Security Council.
Also, right, as a part of the UN General Assembly, it recognized both Russia and Ukraine as independent states, and it has not changed its position ever since. For me, this is the fact. This is a legal fact. Now, then there is, of course, the view of Vladimir Putin. And that is absolutely correctly never assumed that Ukraine is a state and that Ukrainian president is an equal.
But is Pete Hegseth right when he says, look, let's be realistic, we're not going back to the 2014 borders? It's just the facts on the ground.
Whether Pete Hegseth is right or not depends only on the Pentagon. And if this is his vision of the future, it's the stretch of his imagination and the imagination of his boss, Donald Trump, which is going to define the future. If this is as far as their imagination is stretching, if this is as far as they are able to commit resources, that indeed will be the future. However, we have to understand that if the U.S. enters into a major geopolitical struggle today with zero negotiating position for a simple reason that the people who are negotiating have zero competence about what they're negotiating about, that means something for the European Union as well. Because if you listen to Putin's addresses to the Federal Assembly, where he outlined exactly his vision, not only of Ukrainian president, but also of the presidents of France and Germany, you may read and you may find quotes of the last 4 years that it's exactly the same way that he views France and Germany as countries which used to be big empires, but today became small and powerless states. And I quote there. And this means something when we look into the future as Pete Hegseth sees it. This means something for the future of Europe when you listen to Pete Hegseth and he's saying, now it is up to the Europeans to take that future into their own hands. It means that it's not just Ukraine that the US is about to ditch right now. It is about to ditch Europe as well.
Well, we heard sharp reaction to what the U.S. Defense Secretary, usually when there's a NATO meeting going on, allies are hesitant about so openly criticizing a fellow member, particularly when it's the most powerful one by far. Let's take a listen.
It is clear that any deal behind our backs will not work. Any agreement will need also Ukraine and Europe being part of it. And this is clear that appeasement also always fails.
It is regrettable, and I say this myself, but it's part of the truth. The Trump administration has already made public concessions to Putin before negotiations have even begun.
Joachim Biederlich, you're listening there to Boris Pistorius. Since when are Germans so feisty?
Well, I understand the Europeans insofar, because they feel a bit put aside by the Americans. But I've been expecting such a step by the Americans. But the Europeans should have, at an earlier stage, made it clear to the Americans what's their strategy of negotiations with Putin, in order to get Putin at the table of negotiations. I did never hear any word of the Europeans insofar. And therefore, it's perhaps in many eyes the wrong step in the beginning. Yes, maybe. But now let's see whether Putin comes at the table and what could be, let's say, the bargaining chips in such a negotiation.
But do you agree with Boris Pistorius that it's very poor negotiating to make these statements from the get-go?
But it's very nice for me to tell this now to the German media. What I'm waiting for since months is what's the European strategy, including of the Germans, of the German government, of Mr. Pistorius and Mrs. Baerbock and Mr. Scholz. What is their strategy towards, let's say, a peacemaking process in Ukraine? I regret. I've made proposals from 2019, just before the beginning of the invasion. Yes, I've not been taken seriously by anyone in Berlin or in Paris. The only one who took me seriously were the British. And I'm still astonished why the Europeans, let's say, trying to assist the Ukraine. The Ukraine has not been, up till now, the real winner of the war. And therefore, it's a bit strange to hear now, let's say, talking badly about the Americans. I regret what the Secretary of State has presented in NATO is what I call the realistic situation, as it is. And therefore, you have to make a first move to get Putin at the table. Otherwise, you will not get him at the table. Because I don't see a majority in NATO accepting the accession of Ukraine. I don't see, especially the Americans, neither the former nor the actual administration, ready to do so. The same applies, by the way, to the European Union. And therefore, the guarantees of security, who could give such guarantees? The Europeans, without the Americans, are too weak to do it. Therefore, What's for me the astonishing side of the Europeans is this, let's call it defensive position, inviting Trump to act in the way he has always been acting.
All right, let's pick up on that point. Even though Trump, as you say, said that he would try to force a deal, Europeans, like foreign ministers who met Wednesday right here in Paris to talk about Ukraine, were clearly caught out. One senior official telling the Financial Times that Trump sees us as money, and frankly, we haven't been clear on what our seat at the table would look like in exchange for that money. And a quote, is there a point taken there, Anastasia Shepachkina, that the Europeans haven't formulated a clear plan of what they want, because they do have financial clout if they don't have the military clout here?
Absolutely a point well taken about the lack of strategy by any several countries have strategy and they voiced it clearly, but the European Union as a whole does not have a strategy and was not ready to voice it. Now, that being said, Europe today is finding itself in exactly the same place as Ukraine vis-a-vis both Russia and the US. It's the European security architecture which is being negotiated now between Trump and Putin, because it is only the European security architecture that Putin said he cared about during the whole diplomatic negotiation before the start of the full-scale invasion between December and February 2021, 2022. He only cares about this. And the fact that Europe is finding itself outside, cut out of the negotiations, they will not be invited and they are not welcome because they are viewed, their leaders are viewed as the same insignificant, small country leaders, and probably no country leaders, maybe some of them, as Ukrainian leader is. And the inability to react to that.
But can the EU leverage its financial clout? So how does it do it? Explain.
It has to first name, for example, you have Kubilius, who's been appointed now the defense representative for defense by the European Commission. And you have Kaja Kallas, who is now heading the Foreign Service.
This is the former Estonian prime minister who's now there.
And of course you have von der Leyen, who is the head of the Commission. Now, any of them can come and remind that, for example, in 2023 and 2024, 50% of the physical military aid to Ukraine and financial military aid to Ukraine came from the European Union, and 50% came from the US. And we're talking about really military aid, not some other aid, okay? And then to say that if the US wants any of those points that they have evoked, for example, European troops or security guarantees or continued financial assistance, etc., they must be included through one person, two people, whatever the conditions the Europeans, however Europeans define themselves, they must be included in the negotiations.
Or else what?
Or else they are not going to be the reliable ally America expects them to be, because importantly, while Pete Hexas says
but they're shooting themselves in the foot. If they decide that they walk away, it's the Ukrainians who suffer.
But the negotiation between Europe and the US is not about Ukraine. The negotiation is about the alliance, which is both financial, trade, and military alliance.
Jean-Luc Lignastier.
Well, I think unfortunately, it's a long tradition of Europe to pay for the jazz band without setting the tune. So, but they would like to, but they can't, because they're so divided. They are divided. There are different interests and so on. So,
I mean, you heard the urgency with which Kaja Kallas spoke, the new EU foreign policy chief. She's from one of these frontline states, a former Soviet state, Estonia.
But let's take this example. Kaja Kallas, in June 2021, refused. She was the only one. She was prime minister of Estonia at that time. And at that time, Merkel and Macron, seeing Biden and Putin discussing directly over the head of the Europeans in Geneva, and it was a question of deconflicting the Black Sea and some other items concerning Europe, and they discussed it directly without us. And so Merkel and Macron said, okay, we have to discuss with Putin. We have to take this file into our own hands. And Kaja Kallas at that time said, sorry, it's okay, the Americans deal with that, and we are not in charge, and so on. So I have doubt even about Kaja Kallas.
Kerevan Gorgistani?
I mean, yes, Europe has made many mistakes in the strategy and the lack thereof. But I think there's one thing that really struck me in what Pete Hegseth was saying was that he's basically saying in the same breath, you Europeans have not been paying enough, have not been committing enough defense. You need to take matters into your own hand. This is your backyard. This is your problem. It's your continent, blah, blah, blah. And then they just made the biggest decision about Europe's future security over their heads without talking to them before. Because yes, you can say, why didn't the Europeans go and talk to Trump before he spoke to Putin to give them their strategy? But the US is a European ally. The US, if they were playing their role as an ally, could have gone first to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, been, this is what we're going to do. Do you have a better plan? They didn't. So they are acting not like the allies, and at the same time, they're asking the Europeans to take matters into their own hand, but they're not giving them a seat at the table to discuss the future of the security of Europe.
You agree with that, Joachim Bitterlich, that the United States not playing its role as leader of NATO by not first consulting with its allies?
Well, when I look back to American presidents, the last one who has been taking seriously the Europeans, the last two ones who has been taking seriously the Europeans have been Bush Sr. and Clinton. Since then, it's fading away. And my impression is, and I take the other file, which is as, let's say, with a certain importance for the Europeans too, trade and investment. I've been asking the German business people to formulate their positioning, their expectation to any future American administration, either Republican or Democrats, before last summer, in order to take an offensive position to make clear what we want from the US. No, I failed. I failed. The Germans were not ready to do it, nor the French, by the way. And I'm not astonished at all that the Americans, under these conditions, act on their own. Where are the Europeans who have taken contact with now Trump, even before, respecting his style to some extent, and making him clear what the Europeans want and what's for us the minimum in such an alliance. And therefore, well, it's regrettable, but it's the situation as it is now. Therefore, I'm a bit, let's say, astonished by those in Europe who wake up now saying it's a catastrophe. For me, it was clear from the beginning that the Americans would expect from the Europeans to finance at least the reconstruction of the Ukraine once their peace talks is successful. No more. But as a real place at the same level with the Americans, I don't see this with either with Biden or with Trump.
But because it's excuse me, Ambassador Bitterlich, because this is bilateral, right? It's going over everyone's head. Does that, and that was a point made by Anastasia earlier, call into question the whole security architecture of Europe as it has stood since the end of World War II? Does it mean the end of the U.S. being reliably there come hell or high water for the Europeans? At his closing press conference, Pete Hegseth, the new U.S. Defense Secretary, said that, of course, the United States still believes in Article 5, where an attack against one is an attack against all within NATO. But should Europeans believe him?
To a limited extent, yes.
To a limited extent?
Yes.
What do you mean by limited?
Limited is what I call Article 5, a real military attack against any member state. And please read out Article 5. Article 5 is less constraining than Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty. Everyone can choose his ways and means, let's say, to support the ally which is attacked. And therefore, what we need is what I call the American nuclear umbrella. Yes, But I think for me it's clear for some years, it has been clear for some years that the Americans ask us to take over much more responsibility of our defense. And what's the answer of the Europeans? The Europeans, the wake-up call has up till now, let's say, a limited, result, extremely limited. It's not a real result in my eyes.
Kedevan Dorjestani.
I think that this is exactly what people like Vladimir Putin want to hear, because yes, I agree, Article 5 is not so clear-cut, and the only reason why Article 5 has, in a way, worked, if you will, until now, is because there was no doubt about the Americans following through on Article 5, even though Article 5 is not clear-cut. Once you start saying limited, maybe, we'll decide, whatever, once you put into doubt the question of whether or not Article 5 will hold, that's it. Part of Article 5's power is the belief that it's deterrence. It's the belief that people and the countries that are involved in NATO will all react. If there is a doubt, then Article 5 doesn't really matter.
And this belief is definitely now crushed by Pete Hegseth's words. Because not only, and I agree with this, with Ambassador Bitterle, that not only he introduced the limits, he outlined the limits by suggesting what Europe's role should be, to foot the bill for what? Because Europe is not invited to the negotiating table, but is expected to foot the bill for sending its own troops into Ukraine to then ensure whatever security guarantee Europe alone is to give by the American orders. But then Pete Hegseth introduces and outlines exactly the limits of Article 5. But when Europeans, at the American bequest, send their troops into Ukraine, they cannot, under any circumstances, expect to be covered by Article 5. And so now we know when Article 5 will not be activated. It will not be activated when it is up to the Americans to send their troops to Europe, because Pete Hegseth said Americans will not send their troops to a European war theater, which today is in Ukraine. I'm sorry to announce that. And the second thing he said is that Europe is no longer a security priority for the US. That was the real important message that was not so clearly sounded, maybe, or not believed. It was clearly sounded by the Trump then future administration during the election campaign, but it wasn't believed at all in Europe. Now, yesterday, it was sounded super clearly. And that means that not only Ukraine is in trouble, that is the whole message about the future of NATO. And to test this, the only thing Putin now has to do is to cross the border into a state of his choice, be it Finland, be it Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland, or whatever other country he chooses to cross into. Because today he doesn't even need to introduce tanks into a marshy territory. Enough is to send a swarm of drones, actually.
Well, that's also part of it already. We have what's called so-called hybrid warfare. But is it the end of Article 5 as we know it? And that grain of doubt, as has been outlined by Kedevan and Anastasia, Ambassador de Clignasti, does it mean the end of NATO as we know it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Everybody knows, de Gaulle said, that big states have no friends, only interests. So at the present moment, it's true that Ukraine is not a vital interest for America. Ukraine as an independent state, yes, okay. Donbass, not at all. Article 5, it's important because the US is a nuclear power. And you can accept a certain level of that because no country can risk a nuclear war. And so I think Article 5 is still effective, even if the commitment of America is not so strong as before.
Why? Because of France and the UK, which are also nuclear powers?
Because there is a nuclear risk. There is a nuclear risk. If you invade, for instance, Estonia, which is a scenario which could be possible.
You claim that you need to go into Kaliningrad, for instance?
Kaliningrad is Russia, as far as I know.
No, but I mean, if the Russians say that Kaliningrad's under threat, is that where the problem may arise? Or
yes, the problem. I think if there's a weakening, too much a weakening of NATO, of everything, it's true that the Baltic state is a temptation for Russia, especially if there is a blockade of the Finland Gulf. So there's a risk there, but a small risk, because I think Article 5 still plays a role because the US is a huge nuclear power.
A small risk, Ketevan Gorgistani?
Of
Article 5 being tested?
Well, look, I think one of the things that is happening with this, and we'll see where this goes and what the actual peace process is and deal is in the end. But one of the worries, especially of the Europeans, is the emboldening of Vladimir Putin. I still hear to this day those who are saying, well, you know, Ukraine is specific because Russia, Ukraine, they have this history, as if he's going to be fine with 20% of Ukraine and he's going to stop there. All the Eastern European states know and have been telling the rest of NATO for years now, this is not going to stop unless we stop him. And I think that Vladimir Putin has said it himself very often about his grand vision of this grand Russia and he is not going to stop unless he is stopped. So will he test Article 5 in the next year? Maybe not, but gradually at some point he's going to run out of countries that are not in NATO. And maybe at some point he's going to turn to countries in NATO. And who knows, maybe in 10 years, NATO is going to be stronger. Maybe in 10 years, NATO is going to be weaker. And what happens then?
What happens then? Quick final question, Anastasia Shapachkina, and this goes beyond Ukraine. A U.S. president who's coveting Greenland,
and Panama and Canada.
Do you make sense of it?
I think that, again, to me, the key performance that we are witnessing in this dog and pony show is the performance of incompetence. And I think when Ambassador Dynasty was just saying, quoting General de Gaulle, we have to all appreciate the simple fact that Donald Trump for sure doesn't know the name of General de Gaulle, doesn't know why so many streets are called General de Gaulle in France, if he ever noticed that name, and neither does Pete Hegseth. And for sure, we can be 100% certain that neither of them has ever read any line that General de Gaulle has ever written, unless he's written it on Twitter. And that is a core of a problem, because that also goes for the desire to read or understand Article 5, any article of the European Treaty, and any article of anything written at all. This is not a reading audience that we are facing now. And this is not a reading audience on the political will of which is going to depend all of that nuclear deterrence. Because nuclear deterrence is not based on an automatic line written in Article 5 or any other article. It's only and solely based on the political will of a leader of a country, and there are several, which owns a nuclear weapon. And that political will today in the US is resting on the backs of the leaders who are prone to read no more than 120 signed messages on X.
All right.
This is the tragedy.
On that happy note, we'll have to leave it there. Anastasia Shapachkina, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Ketevan Gorgistani, Jean de Glignasti, Joachim Bitterlich for being with us from Normandy. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24.